Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's DevOps Chat. I'm really delighted to have with me today Tuuli Bell. Hi, Tuuli.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me here today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us. I met you a couple of years ago at BCS Configuration Management Conference, and I remember I went to present on how we'd migrated to GitHub and some of the implications for us. What really surprised me during the conference, I think, was how much interest there was in DevOps and how much talk there was about DevOps from a group of people who I would normally have expected to be much more from a kind of traditional service management background. So we're going to talk about DevOps and service management, but maybe before we start that discussion, could you tell us a little bit about your background, what you've done in the past, and also what your interests are currently?
Certainly. So my background originally was in physics, to be honest, and then I moved into service management. And within service management, I worked with a number of vendors. I worked in a number of roles, all the way from pre-sales to technical partner management. Met lots of people. Also, I was quite active at the BCS service management group. And then last year, I moved to work for TASOP as a partner manager, which is a very DevOps-focused company, but they wanted someone with a service management background to kind of help marry those DevOps and service management. And it's been a very, very interesting journey, definitely.
All right.
Been there almost a year now.
Yeah. So coming from more of a service management, from a physics background originally, then more a service management background, and now perhaps applying some of that thinking, but more within an organization that's used to a DevOps way of working. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's been great to see the different, the changes really, and also it's not necessarily about the attitude, because the attitude, I think, in both is about let's focus on the business, let's make the business successful, let's look at the business goals. But there's so many different words that people use, the way, especially the focus or the lack of process on focus on process. That's a huge difference. And also how you share data. And if you think of any kind of service management, when I think of service management, I think of some kind of incident management diagram or something like that. You know, you have a process diagram, you have these people there, you have a couple of different bits of technology. And then you have a start and an end. And when you go to DevOps, it might seem a bit chaotic, to be honest, to start off with, because you don't necessarily have such a defined, this is start and this an end type of process. And I think that, in fact, that somehow works better, maybe even with a human life, because you don't really have a start and end, even in a project or especially in a job. It's all kind of continuously changing, continuously improving, but you don't necessarily have such a rigid process. But then when you start looking for this standardized process, you can definitely find opportunities to standardize at least parts of those. It's more like procedure. So when we talk about process versus procedure, it's most like spotting that opportunity for a procedure that we can standardize and then repeating that procedure. But yeah, it's been a great journey, definitely.
So that's really interesting. So you arrived at the company that you're working for now, and they were working in what you've described as a DevOps way. So could you just give maybe a brief summary of what you mean by working in a DevOps way? Was it?
Well, the first big change, and it was great to see that we have this internal wiki, and everyone is sharing all the information, and you almost, coming from a place where, let's say, you have a knowledge management system in a service management environment, it's very, as everyone knows, it's kind of very well categorized, and it's very, you have this process of updating a page every so often, and then it goes to approval and all of that. Whereas, for example, we have an internal wiki. I can edit any page if I wanted, and everyone can watch and everyone can see kind of the lifespan of that page. And even if you take that as a comparison, that's a huge mindset difference. So it's very transparent. I'm not saying that service management isn't transparent, but it's transparent in a different way.
Yeah.
So for example, in service management, you have a very, very transparent process. So everyone knows, if this happens, then this will happen, and this will happen, and this will happen. Whereas in the DevOps environment, the transparency comes from sharing that data, sharing that information, but not necessarily having a well-defined process as in a service management environment.
And were there other examples, as you say, of things that you thought, okay, well, that's very, very different?
So one is, so some of the words are quite different. And I know, in fact, one of the biggest differences was, so again, I do love process. I love, knowing and understanding incident, problem, change, and requests, service requests, and so forth.
Yeah.
And then I went to work for this company, and they use the word tickets, and I thought that sounds somehow wrong. And so before then criticizing that word ticket, which is very easy for a service manager to kind of criticize, you can't use the word ticket because it doesn't mean anything. You don't know whether it's a service request, you don't know whether that's an incident. And so then I thought, okay, let's take a step back and trying to understand why we're using this. And it's because we're looking at service management, but from, say, a developer side, we're looking at a service management process from someone in a testing environment, in project management, and they really see just a ticket, right? They need information, what's on that ticket, and then they take that information, what they need, and they convert that anyway into their projects or their requirements or their defects and so forth. So they just use that in a different way. And so it kind of makes sense, but it was quite shocking at first, but it definitely works. So I think the key point really, and this is something that I mentioned on, anyone that I speak to, is trying to understand first where the other person's coming from. Yeah. Because when you can understand how the other person works, then you understand that there's a reason why they work that way. And that gives you an opportunity then to figure out some changes that you can make together. Yeah. If it makes sense for you and it makes sense for me, then let's make that change. But trying to understand first why this is done that way before, criticizing, you shouldn't be doing that way. It's not the ITIL way. It's what lots of people would say. ITIL is definitely great, but it's also there for adoption and adaptation as well. Yeah.
So that's two really interesting points. What strikes me about the first example you gave there of a wiki is it's very similar to the experience of, our UK CTO, Ryan Bryars, has been very passionate about introducing the use of a wiki across the business in the UK. And I think it's fair to say we've seen a shift in culture and mindset as a result of that tooling. So I think across all the DevOps chats we've had, we generally say, it's not really about tooling, it's more about attitude and mindset. But actually sometimes a change in tool helps to stimulate that change in mindset. So it encourages a different way of working.
I do definitely agree. And I think when it comes to choosing any technology or introducing a new bit of technology or even removing a bit of technology, it's very, very important to appreciate and realize the changes that it makes on people's lives. Yeah. Because it's not necessarily just, making things better. It might be doing things better for one person, but what does it mean for the underlying process? What does it mean for the attitude, for the culture? Yeah. Because as you said, if there's already what they call a DevOps transformation or another type of digital transformation going on, then getting another tool set in place will definitely, help, also in some cases hinder, but it will typically then help that transformation and accelerate it. If you're doing that at the right time, in the right environment. So then definitely, you're already, in this mode. For example, when you introduce a wiki, let's make it more transparent, then introduce a wiki, it kind of all works really nicely together. I definitely think that can work very well. Now, in the same way, I think it's very important to always once in a while take a look at the tool set. So take a look at the processes, take a look at how people work, and really sit back and think, how can we do this better? Is there something that we could do differently? Or, things change, environments change, even things like, if you move from one a country or a town to another,
Yeah.
that has a huge impact on the people working in that organization. So there's lots of different changes.
And again, that was something we talked about recently with Neil Connett, about the fact that you can move people around, whether that's in an office or, as you say, geographically. Although sometimes even if you put people together physically, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to work together in a particular way. You have to be very mindful that those changes, it can be difficult to introduce.
Yeah. So for example, I did want to actually mention, so for example, I work a lot remotely, and one of the biggest changes, I forgot to say this, was we're using video cameras at work every single day. And that was also a small change. I thought first it's a small change, but it actually makes a huge difference, because when you work in that global team, it doesn't matter that we're not in the same place all the time, but you can see and hear the person reacting, and it's a lot more easier, that communication, when it's not just phone or it's not just email. I mean, that's very impersonal, but you can actually see the other person, so it also makes it more effective.
I was reminded, this is a bit of a tangent here, but I was reminded just yesterday, I was organising one of the other DevOps chats, and I realised how slow email now seems. If you think how fast email felt compared with post, now email feels incredibly slow compared with instant messaging or conference call or video calls. It's amazing, I think, the change we've seen in communication technology. But I also wanted to come back as well to your second point, which was about language. And firstly, I almost feel like I want to vent, which is, so I know in the past I've seen people become incredibly frustrated with ITIL when you have this sort of, well, is it an incident or is it a problem? And different SLAs and different people you need to speak to. And of course, ultimately, you still have one person in the business or a customer who just wants the thing fixed. They don't care whether it's classified as an incident or a change or a problem. They just want something mending that's broken. But I think and I'm surprised actually at this, I don't think yet we've ever talked on any of the DevOps chats about language and the importance of language and how the use of language might influence the way people work. So I suppose what you're saying is that, yes, ITIL has quite a well-defined lexicon, doesn't it? Very specific vocabulary that has very specific meanings. DevOps probably doesn't have a very well-defined lexicon, but I guess teams do start to use terms and terminology in particular ways. Does that match your experience? Yeah,
and in fact, one of the interesting points was, so when I joined the company, TaskHub, I actually got this lexicon. So I got a book that explains all the different terms that they use internally. So maybe in an environment who don't have a very well-defined kind of dictionary, such as ITIL or something, you do want to have some kind of and as you said, people will start using some kind of terminology, whether that's informal or formal or formalized. And so it was really nice to get some kind of almost like a dictionary to help start with, understanding what different words mean and how different things work. And maybe I think that applies to all of DevOps really. In DevOps, you don't have the kind of terminology. So you might talk about a requirement, or even if you don't talks about a sales process even, or like technical validation, proof of concepts, proof of values, or testing something or testing cycles. Everyone's kind of using different words. And then when I work as a partner manager, I try and always help them define and at least communicate how we define terms, and then say, you don't have to define it this way, but this is how we define it. So when I use this term, this is what it means. So I don't need to kind of redefine it and then explain afterwards, oh, I meant a different thing. And maybe that's something that that's what we need in DevOps, is kind of like a handbook of terms and terminologies and different words, and say this is what this means by default, and then if you use it in a different context or a different way, then just redefine it.
And I guess it's a reflection of where DevOps is in its stage of evolution, that probably isn't absolutely defined. But for example, I've seen the difference between continuous deployment and continuous delivery, which is somewhat arbitrary to me, but the general rule seems to be that deployment means deployment into a test environment of some sort, whilst continuous delivery means delivering into a production environment.
Production, yeah.
But I've also seen the release versus deploy kind of terminology, where you might, and this is where it gets confusing, because in that situation, deploy means deploy into production.
Yeah.
Well, and what it's saying is that you might deploy some software, but release is the point where you actually activate the change for the purpose of the customer seeing. So in other words, you might deploy 20 times, but you might only enable the new functionality, after the 20th deployment. So as you say, there's all these subtle meanings, and I suppose it's very valuable because it lets people communicate very efficiently and very quickly. But equally, if people don't have the same idea of what those words mean, then you can, I suppose, very quickly end up with confusion. And also it makes it very hard for people to move between companies or even between teams in one company and have a common, because one of the great benefits of having a common language is, it's like you said, you needed a dictionary, or it was helpful to have a dictionary when you joined. But of course, if everyone's using ITIL, then actually those quite complicated terms are already defined for people, and it's easier to slot straight in. So you gave a presentation earlier this year on DevOps and service management. Were these the sort of themes that the things you've mentioned here, were they the things you discussed during that talk?
Yes and no. So there's a couple of things I've not mentioned. So during that talk, that was at the BCS as well, and it was quite an interactive session, and we looked at the differences between service management and DevOps. And so I asked for feedback from the audience. And so I started asking, are you from a service management, DevOps environment type of thing? Most people were from service management, and there were a few people who would consider themselves more DevOpsy. And so we started with a type of person that you would typically associate, so kind of a little bit of stereotyping. But you talk about a person who works in DevOps, typically, what are their characteristics? And then you'd look at someone who's working in service management, again, looking at the characteristics. And when you start listing whatever comes to your mind, so I just wrote down whatever the audience says, and you actually get these lists which are quite different. And then you start looking at the differences from, for example, about the type of tools people use, or communication tools. I think that was one of the biggest differences, again, in fact, which I forgot to mention. So things like, you mentioned email and messaging already, but for example, I use a lot more messaging at the moment. So things like Slack or Skype or something like that, or text or WhatsApp even, just anything that works for whoever I'm working with. And then less so email, or email when I have to use email, for example, across time zones works really nicely. And then video messaging as well. Whereas in a service management environment, typically when you look at the communication methods, a lot of that's email. Sometimes that's a walk-in kind of service desk type of thing. You've seen those cafes, like service desk cafes, which I think they're pretty cool. And then you obviously have a service management tool set, which is typically regarded as the one single place where you should have all that information. Whereas in DevOps, I don't think you really have that. So you don't have that one single tool set, because all your testing people will say, oh, this is the one that we want to use. Your requirements, they want to use some kind of requirements management tool. Then you have project managers, they want to use their specific tool set. You have developers who all want to use their developer tool sets, and then they do all these deployments and so forth. So it's a very different environment in that sense. And so you start getting quite a few differences between the DevOps and the service management. And then at some point we start talking about the language. What type of, again, what characterizes the people who are working in those environments. So are you, process focused? Are you focused on sharing that knowledge, and at which point do you share, and what knowledge do you share, and why do you do that? Now, you always have pros and cons. If you share too much, that's like too much information and you don't know where to go. And so it slows things down. And or self-service, for example, again, how is self-service regarded? Is that regarded as impersonal, or is that regarded as a helping hand and really convenient, for example? So you have different attitudes. And so we had all these differences between the two different sides. And then we tried to look at the similarities. Now, if you think of what does DevOps try and do? DevOps really tries to make whatever the business wants to try and find a way to do and to meet those business goals better, right? That's what it's there for. And if you look at service management, service managers will work with the business owners as well, and the business process owners, and delivering those services better and in a more meaningful way to the customer. So it's really all aligned with the business. It's all aligned with the business goals, whatever that might be. They do both have a higher purpose, but it's very odd, really, that we don't necessarily talk so much about why service management exists and why DevOps exists, because when you look at the why, there's a lot of similarities. But it's only because all the operational links are so different, like how we work, where we work, how is knowledge and data processed. All of that is so different. So we kind of forget that, in fact, we're here all for the business. And when you start focusing on the why, you then realize, actually, we're working towards the same goal, and we should all be really good friends. But
so that's a fantastic point. I'm conscious a little bit of time already. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground there. So I think, clearly what you're saying, and you're absolutely right, I think, is that at the highest level, the goals are the same. We're trying to do things better for the business, and that applies in service management and it applies in DevOps. But as you've described, there are actually quite a lot of differences in language, in the types of people, and in the ways of working and the tooling between those two approaches. So I suppose I'd be really interested to finish off with your view on, if we see service management and DevOps as kind of separate at the moment, do you think they're going to stay separate? Do you think over the years we're going to see convergence? Or do you think they might even diverge and become more distinct and separate as time moves on?
So I think they're going to converge. I think, but again, whether that's into one area where you focus more on the technology, and then you have one where you focus more on the process side of things. But I think I'd like to see them both converge, because there's so many great things about DevOps and there's so many great things about service management, and obviously all the different frameworks that underpin those. If we could combine those, I think that would be definitely the best way forward, and I think that's happening. I went to a couple of conferences on both subjects early June, and especially in the service management conference at the SITS show, you could see that there were already lots of talks on DevOps and service management, not so much vice versa, but I think that's definitely something that people are looking at, how can we improve? So we're looking at other areas of the business.
I mean, I think very simplistically, I get the impression that people who are more from a DevOps background feel a bit like, oh no, forget service management, that's yesterday's news. And my sense is that the service management community is a bit more open-minded about trying to get the best out of the new approaches and practices that are coming from DevOps. And I guess it's sort of, the key is how can we get all the benefits and the value from the new DevOps techniques, practices, approaches, but also, I suppose, benefit from the many years of hard-won experience that have gone into developing some of the service management approaches. It's almost like having the kind of the wise old person of the community, isn't it? Who has learned something over the years, meeting the young kids who want to try everything and have never seen anything go wrong in the way that perhaps some of the more battle-hardened people have. Okay, so that's a nice vision for the future, I think, trying to get the best of both worlds and seeing some convergence over the coming years. And it's heartening, I think, to hear that you're already starting to see that in some of the interactions you're having with people in service management. So thank you very much for your time today, Tuuli. Really interesting to hear your thoughts and views on that. And I'm also really looking forward to the discussion on Twitter as well when you'll be joining us too. So yeah, thank you very much. Really interested. And we'll speak again soon.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.